Boker. Daf Yomi is Kesubos Daf Lamed, but we're going to start on Lamed Gimel Amabez around 2/3 of the way down at the two dots. So we've seen up until now a contradiction between our Mishnah in Kesubos and the Mishnah in Makos. The Mishnah in Kesubos states that a woman who is assaulted, if she's your sister, you pay her the kanas, pay her the penalty. Whereas the Mishnah in Makos says you get lashes. So it's a apparent contradiction. So we saw the answer, the resolving of this contradiction, according to the opinion of Ula, was that the Mishnah in Malkos was dealing with an adult, and therefore there's no fine, so you just get lashes. Whereas the Mishnah in Kesubos was dealing with your sister, who was a Nara, who was an adolescent between 12 and 12 and a half, and therefore you paid a fine. That's the resolved way Ula resolved it. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan says the Mishnah in Malkos is where you were warned for lashes, and so therefore you get the lashes. Whereas the Mishnah in Kesubos, you weren't warned for lashes, therefore you get the penalty, the fine. Rish Lakish comes on and gives a different answer. He says, he says, Rish Lakish towards the bottom of 33b, 2/3 of the way down, he says, our Mishnah, which says you pay a penalty, is not meant to exclude lashes, but our Mishnah is the position of Rabbi Meir. Our Mishnah is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says, what does Rabbi Meir say? Rabbi Meir says that loka umishan, that you get lashes and you pay the penalty, meaning you do both. So that's what Rabbi Meir says. Rabbi Meir says, in addition to paying the penalty, you also get lashes. Where it says, Rabbi Meir, if our Mishnah in Kesubos is the position of Rabbi Meir, then afilu bitonami, and even his daughter, if he assaulted his daughter, he should also have to pay the penalty. But we know that the next Mishnah in Kesubos tells us that Rameir says you don't pay a penalty. That Mishnah says you don't pay a penalty in the case of your daughter. If you want to say Rameir says when you have lashes, you do pay the penalty, but when there's death, you don't pay the penalty. Is that really the case, that when there's death, you don't pay the penalty? You don't pay the kanas? Tanya, well, we have the case. Gana v'tabach. Let's say a person stole an animal and slaughtered it on Shabbos. Or gana v'tabach avodas kachavim. Or he stole the animal and he slaughtered it for idolatry. Gana v'shor nisko, or he stole an animal, an ox that was supposed to be stoned, and because it killed another ox, and then he slaughtered it. So normally when you steal an ox, you pay 5 times the amount when you steal it and then you slaughter it or sell it. But in this case, so even though he's going to be put to death here for slaughtering an animal on Shabbos, you still have to pay 4 or 5 times the amount. That's what Rabbi Meir says. So we see that Rabbi Meir says that you do have death and a knas, whereas our Mishnah says that when you assault your daughter, you don't pay the knas. So it can't be that our Mishnah is like Rabbi Meir. But anyway, the price continues. The Chachamim say you're exempt in that circumstance from paying the fine. So the Gemara says, but ha'in marwa, Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Rabbi Amar, Rabbi Yoav, Kol Chavor to Mishmei Rabbi Yochanan. Amar, why in that case does Rabbi Meir say that you're liable? Why in that case does Rabbi Meir say you're liable? It's not because miso mishal and misla. It's not because he holds that you have death and the payment. That's not what's going on here. What's going on here is somebody else did the slaughter. And so therefore that person who did the slaughter gets the death, whereas you have the payment because your agent slaughtered the animal after you stole it. The Gemara says, how could that be? That you're going to be liable because your agent slaughtered the animal. This other person sins and you're liable. You can have an agency for sin. Normally we say we don't have an agency for sin. So Amar Rav Amar Achwana Utivacha or Machara. No, the verse states, and if you slaughter the animal or you sell the animal, just like the selling can be done through another person. Also, if the slaughter can be done through another person. Meaning to say that this is an exception to the rule that there's no agency for sin. In this case, we say there can be agency for sin, specifically based upon the verse. And the Be'er Bishwal Tana Ola Rabbas is a chef. He says we learn that from the fact that it says Ma. It says Utivacho O Mecharo, that it comes to include an agent. The Be'er Chizkiya Tana Tachas Rabbas is a chef. So now we include an agent in the word Tachas. But in all these cases, we see that there can be an agency for sin in these circumstances. So we say in general, Rabbi Meir says, when you get the death penalty, you don't pay the fine. But in this case, you're not getting the death penalty. Somebody else did the slaughter. So therefore, you pay the fine. So So basically, therefore, for that position, Rabbi Meir therefore is saying that our Mishnah in Kesubos is where you have lashes and the penalty. But the Mishnah in Malkos, there's no penalty because she's not a Nara. I mean, there's the Mishnah in Malkos, there's no penalty because she's not a Nara. So the Gemara says, so Zutra says, how's it possible that if he had done the action, if he had slaughtered the animal, he wouldn't have been liable because he was getting the death penalty? Whereas if his agent does it, he's going to be liable. So if he does it himself, he's not liable. If his agent does it, he's liable. Is that really possible? So Mark explains, the reason why he's not liable is it's not because there's no liability, because of this principle that we are giving him the more severe penalty. That's the only explanation. It's not that he's not liable. He is liable, but we're just giving him the more severe penalty. So the Gemara asks the question, well, if we're saying somebody else is slaughtering the animal, and that's the reason why he has to pay for the penalty, he has to pay the penalty because somebody else is doing the slaughter. Well, if that's the case, so if that's the case, why did the rabbis say he's exempt? If you say that there can be an agency for sin and somebody else is slaughtering the animal, why is he exempt from paying the penalty? Where explains, Man Chachamim, who are these Chachamim? On the top of 34a, who are these Chachamim? These Chachamim are Rabbi Shimon. These are Chachamim of Rabbi Shimon who say, Shlita she'ena re'uya, lo shmei shlita. They say, the rabbis are of the position that if it's an invalid slaughter, if the slaughter doesn't really accomplish anything, doesn't allow the animal to be eaten, it's not considered a slaughter. And so therefore, since it's not considered a slaughter, you're going to be exempt from the punitive damages of paying 4 or 5 times the amount of the animal that was stolen and then slaughtered. And the Gemara says, fine, I can understand if it's hatenach avodas kochavim. I can understand if it's a slaughter that was done for idolatry, because then we're going to say you're not allowed to derive any benefit from it. So the slaughter accomplishes nothing. Or shor nisko, or if it was an ox that was said to be stoned, because that ox's dera is not allowed to have any benefit from it. Shlita Shabbos, but if it was an ox that was slaughtered on Shabbos, Shlita Re'uyahi, that's a completely valid slaughter. The Tanana, Shochet b'Shabbos, of Yom Kippurim, as we learned in the Mishnah in Chulin and in Baba Kama, we learned Shochet b'Shabbos, Yom Kippurim. Let's say you slaughter on Shabbos or Yom Kippur. Afal Pisha Mischayev b'Nafsho, even though you're liable for death, Shlita so Kshera, it's a completely valid Shlita. So we see from here that is a valid Shlita. So if that's the case, why do the rabbis say you're exempt from the penalty? It's a valid Shlita. So Gemara explains, Savarwa, the Rabbanan, of this brisa are in accordance with the position of Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar. The Tanya, what did Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar say? I'm a vashel b'Shabbos, and one who cooks on Shabbos, b'shogeg, if he cooks accidentally, yochal, then he's allowed to eat it. But meizir, if he cooks intentionally, he will yochal. Devar Rabbi Meir. That's Rabbi Meir's position. Rabbi Huda says, and the Rambam and most Rishonim paskin like this position of Rabbi Huda. B'shogeg yeyachal on motzi Shabbos. If you cook accidentally on Shabbos, and the one who cooked can eat it after Shabbos. B'meizid, if you cook intentional, lo yochal olamis, he cannot eat it forever. But the rabbis of this brisa are not like Rabbi Huda; they're even stricter. Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar says, "B'shogeg yochal motzi Shabbos la'cheirim." If he cooked accidentally, other people could eat it motzi Shabbos. The low, whereas he himself cannot. But meizid, if you cooked it intentionally, lo yochal olamis. If he cooked it intentionally, he can never eat it. Not him or not other people. So that's the reason why this is not a valid slaughter, because the person slaughtered it intentionally on Shabbos, and therefore nobody could ever eat it. And so therefore it's not a valid slaughter. Therefore the rabbis say you're exempt from the fine, from the punitive damages. My time with Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar. So the Gemara goes on a little bit of a tangent. What's the reasoning behind Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar's logic that if you slaughter it on Shabbos intentionally, it can never be eaten? So the Gemara explains, Kididarish Reish like Rabbi Chia. Like Rabbi Chia taught that Pitchot Beinasiyah, it's based on a verse, Shmartim es HaShabbos ki kodesh ilachem. You shall guard the Shabbos because it is holy for you. Ma kodesh asur b'achila, just like something that's sacred, kodshim, something that's consecrated to the temple, you're not allowed to eat. Af ma'aseh Shabbos, an action done on Shabbos is asurin b'achila. Says Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar, an action done on Shabbos, you're not allowed to eat. Well, the Gemara asks the question, well, ima kodesh asur ba'anah. Well, kodshim is also, if you consecrate something, you're not allowed to have benefit from it. So maybe af ma'aseh Shabbos asur ba'anah, maybe also ma'aseh Shabbos, you can't have benefit from it. Talmud Omer, the verse states, lachem. The verse states, for you, kodesh ilachem, shelchem yehei, that you get to own it, even though you can't eat it, you get to have benefit from it. Yachal afilu b'shogeg. I might think, even if you violate this Shabbos accidentally, I might think that even under those circumstances, that it'll be prohibited to eat it forever. Says the verse, Tamomer mechalel mos yumas, that one who violates the Shabbos shall be put to death. Meaning to say, intentionally I said to you this law, but not accidentally. So this idea that Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar says that there's this concept of ma'aseh Shabbos, that if you cook on Shabbos intentionally, it's prohibited you forever. So there's a dispute about this between Rav Acha and Ravina. Chad Amar ma'aseh Shabbos is dioraisa. One says it's biblical. Indeed, we have these verses. Shmartim es Shabbos ki kodesh ilachem. Chad Amar d'Rabbanan, and the other one says no, it's actually not biblical. It's rabbinic. Man da'amar dioraisa k'da'amran. The one who says it's biblical, it's like the verse we just cited. Shmartim es Shabbos ki kodesh ilachem. Man da'amar d'Rabbanan. And the one who says it's rabbinic, Amar Krab, Kodeshi. He says, because the verse says it is consecrated. He Kodesh, Rei Maseh Kodesh. Shabbos is holy, but the actions on it are not consecrated. And so therefore it's only rabbinic. Well, the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, well, Ma'ad Amar D'Rabbanan, according to one who says that the ma'aseh Shabbos is rabbinic, now we go back to the question. Well, if the person slaughtered it, then why does he not have to pay the 4 or 5 times the amount? Why don't we say you're liable? Why don't we say you're liable to pay the 4 or 5 times the amount? So the Gemara answers, Ki kapachi Rabbana, when the rabbis say you're exempt, ashara. It's only referring to one who slaughters it for idolatry, one who slaughters it ashur and isko, an ox that was stolen. Because that is a shlita sheina ruya. Those are slaughters that are not valid. So the Gemara says, Gemara says, let's analyze this other case. He said if you slaughtered it for idolatry, then under those circumstances, one who slaughters it for idolatry, so such a person is going to be liable. We said that since the other person slaughtered it, so he did the worship of idolatry, so you're liable for the 4 or 5 times the amount. So whereas the rabbis say you're exempt. So the Gemara says, but how can you ever be liable? How can we say you're liable? Kivan de shachabe porta, once you slaughtered it just a little bit, once you killed a little bit, it's right. It's no longer, it's become prohibited to him. It's something that you're not allowed to have any benefit. And so therefore, since it doesn't have any benefit, it no longer belongs to the person who you stole it from. And so that's what the Gemara says. Given the Shachbe Porta Itzaway, so it's no longer yours, it's now idolatry. So you're not slaughtering or selling the animal that you stole anymore. So the Gemara explains. Given the Shachabe Porta Itzaway, and Idaki Kadabach, when you slaughter the second sign, there are 2 pipes on the animal, the second siman. So when you slaughter the other one, you're no longer slaughtering the ox that you stole. It's now the ox that belongs to the idolatry. It doesn't belong to anybody. He's changed it. So Amarava Ba'omer, no, it's where you indicate Bigmar Zvicha Hu Uvda. You indicate that I'm only worshiping it at the conclusion of the slaughter. So therefore, the slaughter and the transference to the domain of the idolatry happens at the exact same time. Mara says also, Shor Niskal, this is an ox that's supposed to be stoned because it was sentenced to death because it gored another ox to death. Again, he's not slaughtering the ox that belongs to this person because since this ox was sentenced to death, it has no benefit from it. So why do we say that under those circumstances, you have to pay the 4 or 5 times the amount? So I'm a Rab or Rava, depending on the gear. So I'm going Shemasru Shomer. And we're talking about a case. How is this ox? What's the scenario here? That person who owned the ox gave it to a shomer, gave it to a custodian to guard it. The hizik base shomer, and then this ox gored another ox while it was in the custodian's house and put it to death. Nigmar dina bebei shomer, and so then the ox in the custodian's house was sentenced to death. Uganavo ganav bebei shomer, and then the robber broke into the custodian's house and stole it. Rabbi Meir several like Rabbi Yaakov, and several like Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Meir, who says you're liable under these circumstances, it's because he holds by a combination of Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Shimon. He holds like Rabbi Yaakov, several like Rabbi Yaakov. The Amar Av Misha Nigmar Dino Yachziru Shomer Obav Mosar, that even though the ox was sentenced to death, if the custodian would return the ox became sentenced to death on his watch. But if he will return it, he's considered to have properly returned the animal. And so therefore, it's returned. V'savro Rabbi Shimon, and he holds like Rabbi Shimon, says, Davra Garamo Mamon Kamamon Dami. That's something that causes money. It's the equivalent of money. And so even though this ox is not worth anything, but if you slaughtered it, you've caused the shomer to not be able to return it. So you've caused them a loss of money. And he could have returned this ox even though it was worthless, and then he would have been exempt from having to pay anything. And so therefore, for that reason, Rabbi Meir says you're liable. So now we've seen the answer of the Gemara to how we explain the Brisa. The Rabbi Meir says you're liable if it's slaughtered on Shabbos or for idolatry. And how is that possible? So doesn't Rabbi Meir say Mace Umashalim Wasley, that if you're put to death for Kimway B'Daramine, you don't make the payment. So why did we say that the mayor says you're liable here? And the Gemara explains, our mayor's other position, that this was done through an agent. And so therefore, that's why you're liable for the payment. Rabbah comes along and says, no, it doesn't, the slaughter wasn't necessarily done through an agent. Well, it's possible that he slaughtered the animal himself. If that's the case, why does he have liability? Don't we say, so why does he have to pay for the animal? We're on top of 34p. Rabbi Meir, local Meshalim Islay, Mace Meshalim Islay. So, and yes, Rabbi Meir says that really, if your lashes, indeed, you get, that you still pay the punitive damages, but if there's death, you don't. Vashani Hani, but this case is different. Why in this case do we say that, does Rabbi Meir say, in the case of the ox or the sheep, does Rabbi Meir say that you have to pay? Shani Hani, this case of one who slaughters the animal on Shabbos is different. Because even though Rabbi Meir says there's no death and a monetary payment, that's if it's compensatory damages. But this is a punitive damage. This is a fine. And the Torah was mechadesh. It taught us a new law about a punitive damage. And even though you are put to death for violating the Shabbos or the idolatry, you still have to make the punitive damage. By a knas, by a punitive damages case, as opposed to compensatory. And Rabba follows his logic. Rabba gives an example. Let's say he has a goat that he stole. It was already stolen. Utavacho b'Shabbos, and then he slaughtered it on Shabbos. Chayav. Then we're going to say he's liable for the 4 or 5 times the amount, because why is he liable for the 4 or 5 times the amount? Shekvar neschayav v'geneva kodem she'yavo l'dei Isur Shabbos, because he's already liable for the theft prior to Shabbos starting, because the liability for the principal happened prior to Shabbos, and so therefore on Shabbos he's only liable for the payment, for the punitive damage. And Rabbah holds like Rabbi Meir that we don't say kimle b'diramine when it comes to the knas, and so therefore he has to pay for the knas on Shabbos. If so, that's that case. However, ganav v'tabach b'Shabbos, but let's say he stole it and slaughtered it on Shabbos, patur. Under those circumstances, he's going to be exempt. Shem ein geneva ein tevicha ein machira, because if he wouldn't have stolen it, he wouldn't have been able to do the slaughter and the sale. Look at Rashi. If he stole it and slaughtered it on Shabbos, the chi of mamon de keren, because the obligation of money for the principal also have Isur Shabbos. It's going to coincide with the arrival of Shabbos. Then we're going to say it's exempt. The kaimon ein mesu mishalim, because Rabbi Meir is of the position that we don't have death and compensatory. And since we're not going to make him liable for the compensatory for the principal, knas nami lo mishalim, we're also not going to make him liable for the knas. The Torah says you have to pay 4 or 5 times the amount, but not 3 or 4. And he does not hold like Rabbi Nassan, who says, Rashi says a tangent, why are you liable for violating Shabbos? What's through on Rabbi Nassan, who says, that the animal carries itself, and where it's not carrying, or in this case, it was tied up. But the point is, in this case, we're going to say that you are exempt from the payment, because you can't have the kanas without the keren in that circumstance. And since you're exempt from the keren, from the compensatory, you're also going to be exempt from the punitive in that specific case. And the Gemara gives another example of Rabba. I'm a Rabba, haya gediga nuvla. Let's say you had a stolen goat. Utavacho b'machteres. And you slaughtered it while you were in the tunnel. There's a law is habba b'machteres. Somebody who comes in a tunnel to escape into somebody's home, he's liable for death, and the person in the home could kill him. So if this case you have a stolen goat and you slaughtered it in the tunnel, chayiv, then you're going to be liable. Shekfarnas chayiv b'gneva. Because you were liable for the compensatory damages of the theft prior to being in the tunnel. But if you stole it in the tunnel, Potter, we're going to say you're exempt for the same logic. Shemain Geneva, if you didn't steal it, ain't so there's compensatory. And so therefore, since there's also compensatory which don't apply, we're going to say there also is not going to be a kinas. We need both cases. We need the case of the mafteres and we need the case of Shabbos. Yes, we need Shabbos, because if we just had the case of Shabbos, we would say Mishum de Isura Isur Olam. Now, what's the reasoning why? What if we just had the case of Shabbos, we would say that we wouldn't say necessarily the same law with respect to the mafteres, because we would have said, and what's the reason that if you stole it on Shabbos, you're exempt from payment, is because Mishum de Isura Isur Olam, is because the violation of Shabbos is forever. If they come to the court and testify that he violated the Shabbos, the court will always put him to death. So therefore, Shabbos is stricter than a Baba Mafteres case. Ava Mafteres, but the case of the tunnel, you're only liable for death while you're in the tunnel. Ava Mafteres Isur Shahu, it's a temporary sentence to death. Because when you leave the tunnel, the person's not allowed to kill you anymore. We might have thought that this law doesn't apply, and so therefore we wouldn't have said that the obligation for death exempts you from the compensatory damages. And if we just had the case of the mafteres, I would have said, Bishum de maftarto zui yasra also. Because I would have said, what's the reason why you're exempt? Because there's no hasra, there's no warning by the mafteres. Well, Shabbos to buy hasra, but Shabbos requires warning, amalo. I might have said that you're not exempt from compensatory damages. So tzricha, that's why we needed both cases. And Amar Rav Papa taught, I said, para kenuvalo, let's say you had a stolen cow, utavacha b'Shabbos, and then you slaughtered it on Shabbos, chayiv, you're liable for the kinas. Shekfar nasayv b'gneva, kolim she'yavo l'day Yisur Shabbos, because you're liable for the theft even prior to Shabbos coming. Haisa para she'ulo, but let's say the cow was borrowed utavacha b'Shabbos, and then you slaughtered it on Shabbos, then we're going to say you're exempt, because then you stole it and you slaughtered it on the Shabbos. So, because you stole it on the Shabbos, and so then the compensatory damages you're exempt from them, so therefore you're also exempt from the kinas. So I'm only Rav Acha Bereda Rava or Rav Ashi. So he says to Rav Ashi, Rav Papa Paras or Shminu, what's Rav Papa teaching us? We already know this case. This is exactly the same case of Rabba. So the Gemara explains, no, what's he teaching us? I'm only Rav Papa Shu'ua Salashminu. He's teaching that his law, the law of Rabba, also applies to a borrowed cow. Because you might have thought to say, that once you drag the cow, you're liable as a borrowed cow. Once you drag the cow, you're liable to support it. So that's where you kind of own it. Also, that if you borrow the animal, at that case, from the moment you borrowed it, you're liable for the compensatory payment. And so therefore, when you slaughtered it on Shabbos, since you had already been liable for the compensatory payment, you're going to be exempt, you're going to be obligated in the punitive damages. So we say, Kamash Malan, since it's still in existence, you can always return it. When did you acquire it? Only the moment you slaughtered it. And so therefore, The moment you slaughtered it, that's the moment of theft. Amar Rava, so now Rava says, let's say your father left for the children a borrowed cow. So now we're going to talk about borrowed cow. When does liability take effect? So Rava says, if the father left for you a borrowed cow, you could use it all the days that it was borrowed. Mesa, but if the cow died, then you're not obligated. Then you're not obligated for its accident, because since the children are not the ones who borrowed it, so therefore they're not liable for its owners. If the children thought it was their father's cow, and they slaughtered it, and then they ate it, then they have to pay the benefit that they received from the meat, meaning to say the 2/3 of the price of the meat. If their father left for them real estate to pay back debts, then the children have to pay. So we could some say this last clause of Rava, where it says that the children have to pay back the debt, some say that applies to the Reisha, to the first clause, where it says that if they had to borrow a cow, they can use it, and if it dies, they're not obligated to it. And some say it applies to the Seifa. Some say it applies to the latter clause, that if they thought it was their father's and they slaughtered it and ate it, they have to pay the minimum amount. But we're saying no, that if it was real estate, they have to pay the full amount. The one who applies it to the first clause, where it says they can use it all the days of its life, and if it dies, they're not obligated to pay for it. For sure, he would say it applies to the latter case, where you actually slaughtered it and ate it, because you actually did this action. So therefore, for sure, they would have to pay for it, because when they slaughtered it and ate it, and that person argues with the position of Rav Papa, who says that the obligation for accidents only applies at the moment it happens, and not retroactively to the moment of borrowing. Because according to Rav Papa, since the obligation of ones happens only at the moment of ones, and at that moment the animal is in the domain of their heirs, therefore there's no shiba, there's no lien on the father's property. The one who says that it happens in the case where they slaughtered it and ate it, then, and if they have real estate that was meshubah to it, they have to pay it. But where the animal died by an accident, they wouldn't have to pay. That is indeed the case of Rav Papa. Okay, we'll stop here. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to address them.